It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the thematic session 4 of the 7th session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, which will be focusing on implementing nature-based solutions to reduce systemic risk. Allow me to extend a warm welcome to our panelists here this morning, and also to all of those participants who are joining us online, and those who are with us here in Bali today. I'm called Luther Anukur, and I am the Regional Director for Eastern and Southern Africa for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. This morning, we will be focusing on nature-based solutions. As you all are aware, nature is a very powerful tool in the fight against interconnected threats to ecosystem health, human well-being, as well as being key to building resilience in the face of climate change and disasters. When we reflect on the COP26 UNFCCC, where the links between nature and climate change adaptation were heightened, including multiple pledges aimed at protecting ecosystems and reducing disaster risk, this session will be centered around the implementation of nature-based solutions as a means of achieving various targets, including the Sendai Framework, the Rio Convention, the Paris Agreement, as well as Sustainable Development Goals. We'll also be looking at nature-based solutions such as ecosystem disaster risk reduction, which we normally call eco-DRR, and ecosystem-based adaptation, EBA, as strong vehicles for comprehensive risk management to address disaster as well as climate risks. This particular session is also going to focus on scaling up, especially at the background of the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in this particular year. And we know that this is an opportunity to accelerate and scale up the implementation of nature-based solutions in the coming years. We're also aware that with us is a very big opportunity around the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which is led by FAO and UNEP. And this provides huge opportunities for scaling up. One other thing that's also come up, which is a big opportunity, is the fact that IUCN has also developed a global standard for nature-based solutions, which is helping to, which will help or guide the effective implementation of nature-based solutions. So this session is really focused on showcasing how and why nature-based solutions needs to be an integral part of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And we'll be looking at addressing root causes. We'll also be looking at root causes of disaster and climate risk. We'll be looking at mainstreaming, and we'll also be talking about some of the challenges that we do experience and how we can actually overcome those barriers. Before I introduce our panelists this morning, I just want to do some housekeeping. This meeting is taking place both online and on-site using the virtual GP platform and it's being recorded. So if you're watching online and you wish to follow this session in one of the 6 UN languages, you can select the language channel in the box to the right of the video window. It's important that you mute the audio from your video player. Otherwise, we will be able to hear you. Otherwise, you will hear the original language, and so you won't get the translation. There's a short video on the reception page which explains how to do this. Now, Slido, which is which will be used for the Q&A when it comes to the questions during this session, will have a code, and the code is right there on the screen. It's 9656921. Again, 9656921. And this is what we're going to use where you can put all your questions. So we're going to use it for our Q&A. So the participants in the room can connect to the slido.com using their mobile phones and insert the code that is shown on the screen in front of you. For those following us online, in Hopin, please access the tab polls and Q&A on the right side of the menu. If you are in the room and unable to use Slido, please raise your hand, and there are some support staff who will come to your rescue. And if you're in Hopin and unable to use the polls and QA tab or any other Hopin feature, please contact the online support team via the chat box. At this point, I just want to take the opportunity to introduce our various guests this morning in the panel. So on my left is Dr. Mohammed Saparis. He prefers calling himself Saparis. He is the Director of the Watershed Planning and Control in the Directorate and the Director General of the Watershed Management and Forest Rehabilitation at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry of the Republic of Indonesia. So can we please welcome him?
Morning.
And I also have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Sonja Layton Kon, who is the Acting Deputy Executive Director at the United Nations Environment Program, headquartered in Nairobi. And she's been recently the Director of Corporate Services in UNEP and has worked in a number of other UN agencies and has a vast experience on fragile states humanitarian assistance, operations, and working with the private sector. Join me in welcoming Ms. Sonja. I also have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Carolina Diaz Giraldo. So Ms. Carolina is the Director of Environment and Sustainable Development at the Colombian National Development Department. She has extensive experience working in the areas of climate change, disaster risk reduction and management, as well as sustainable development, with lots of years of experience working with the World Bank, but as well as supporting a lot of programs around building risk management policies and adaptation to climate change. Ms. Carolina will be joining us online, and I don't know whether she can be featured. Okay. Then our fourth speaker this morning is Mr. Tabi Jodah. And Mr. Tabi Jodah is a DRR champion. He's an ambassador of the Great Green Wall, a global award-winning indigenous agroforester. He's an author and eco-entrepreneur. He's an expert on local community ecosystems, as well as the executive director of Green Aid and the lead of the 1 Billion Trees for Africa, which is an initiative that aims at planting a number of hectares of degraded land, trees for restoration of degraded lands and ecosystems in the Sahel. Join me in welcoming Mr. Tabi Jodah. And then last but not least is Ms. Carolina Whaley. So Carolina is the head of public service solutions at AXA Climate. She's worked a lot with the development banks, government and municipalities and non-governmental organizations in supporting and building adaptation and climate risk transfer schemes, as well as climate and environmental screenings for development finance. So she comes a lot with experience working with the private sector. So help me join, welcome Ms. Carolina. So we have a privilege this morning of having a very interactive session. We're actually going to watch a video. We'll be having 2 videos this morning, and we'll start with watching the very first video, which will give us a brief introduction to nature-based solutions.
The microcatchments of Aswa River suffers from flooding during the rainy season and prolonged drought during the dry spell.
People from here are now encroaching in the wetlands because of two things. One is keeping their animals in the wetlands. Two, encroachment of cultivation of rice.
The EcoDRR project in Uganda aims to strengthen resilience of 160,000 vulnerable people in the eastern part of the Aswa catchment in the northern part of Uganda. Specifically, the project aims to strengthen integrated risk management and inclusive risk governance through scaling up of ecosystems-based disaster risk reduction, improved integrated water resource management that is risk-informed, gender transformative, and ecosystem sensitive. We have demonstrated a number of models in the 6 microcatchments of Aswa. We have established eco-based enterprises by demonstrating learning hubs for beekeeping and learning hubs for micro-catchment irrigation technologies to support communities to cope with the risks that are associated with flooding and prolonged drought. We have supported communities with processing equipment to aid them from the laborious processing of the shea nut that has been a traditional activity for the Lango people, but this enables women to do it in a less labor-intensive way and saves time for other productive work. These models show how a combination of local indigenous knowledge, local engagement, and scientific approaches demonstrate optimum use of natural resources for community resilience. Through bottom-up planning, the local communities have taken center stage and have been empowered to identify, to prioritize, and take action on issues that affect their resilience.
Anna chalo daho, anuogi na be, ikompitu kich. Acheli ye, oramo kwanya roma nyo kilo sapara biro, apore richani, chakwanya no kenetikan, ti kilo sa bichiel. Ame kila chela charo tutunya para rio, con kilo sa bichiel, no betrua pier biru rio. Ati magina be, na cholo kwan. Chawa titingo wa malu, umeo wani mondang, nyanga be ni. Pemiro dog ping, pitu kich, po we hani choki kena tuero, etu wan mondu shudang tuero jami dusha manisha an.
Yeah, thank you. That's a short video from Uganda, and is a case study that shows 6 microcatchments on the challenges of floods and droughts. So this morning we'll start by reflecting on that video, and also I would want to ask our panelists to speak to some of the elements around systemic risks. We'll start with Ms. Carolina. Why and how can the implementation of nature-based solutions reduce systemic risks? That is the cascading of the impacts that spread within and across systems and sectors. Carolina, please.
Mr. Luther, muy buenos días y muy buenos días para mis compañeros del panel. Un saludo también a las personas que nos están escuchando. Y para entrar directamente en la discusión, hay que señalar que las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza son un concepto bastante amplio que nace de diferentes disciplinas, pero comparten un mismo interés, y es cómo utilizar las funciones de los ecosistemas para resolver problemas, para adaptarnos, en lugar de depender solamente de soluciones convencionales. En este momento, todos los países están trabajando por la reactivación económica y tenemos una oportunidad de integrar las agendas de reactivación en esos temas de gestión del riesgo, cambio climático y biodiversidad, pero sobre todo tenemos una oportunidad única de promover nuevas alternativas económicas basadas en el capital natural, es decir, a través de soluciones basadas en la naturaleza que generan estímulos de economía, empleo, son inversiones para protección de ecosistemas, la adaptación, reducen condiciones de riesgo, ayudan a la seguridad alimentaria y pues también contribuyen con la carbono neutralidad. En Colombia, digamos, tenemos una plataforma muy madura en términos de gestión del riesgo, pero la pandemia nos mostró de una forma muy cruda las vulnerabilidades del país. En noviembre del 2020 ocurrió algo poco frecuente, y es que pasaron por las costas del Caribe colombiano dos huracanes de categoría 4 y 5, el huracán Iota y el huracán Eta, con impactos severos en nuestras islas. Una población que ya tenía una economía en crisis por ser altamente dependiente del turismo y ahora pues con daños severos en infraestructura, servicios, la afectación del arrecife de coral. Y es acá donde vemos como las interdependencias entre los diferentes sectores y que las respuestas fragmentadas no pueden ser la solución. Por eso en Colombia estamos haciendo una transición desde el enfoque convencional de la gestión del riesgo, centrado mucho en los fenómenos naturales y en la amenaza, hacia un enfoque más integral que se centra en el sistema social y ecológico y pues que nos permita aproximarnos a los riesgos sistémicos.
Thank you very much, Carolina. I would want to pass the same question to Ms. Sonja Layton.
Thanks very much for the question. Just as systematic risk triggers cascading impacts that spread through systems, so nature-based solutions can trigger benefits that cascade across many different sectors. That's because our current global crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and the COVID-19 pandemic are closely interlinked. And it's our relationship with nature that underpins all of them. We know that when we degrade the living world, we increase the chance of disasters and the damage that it causes. Degraded forests increase the risk of floods and fires. The loss of wetlands increase the risk of water insecurity and drought. Flip this around, and it means that we look after the living world when we invest in healthy, well-managed ecosystems and nature-based solutions. We can limit the risk of disaster and the heavy cost that it inflicts on people. Healthy ecosystems are the bedrock of resilient societies. And it's not just about ecosystem conservation and restoration. It's also about effectively working with people in a way that addresses the drivers of risk. This is the hallmark of nature-based solutions, and it's what UNEP is doing in Uganda, as shown in the video, as well as in other places around the world, like Haiti and South Sudan, as we seek to harness the power of nature to protect people from impacts of today's crisis. In Haiti, for example, near Port Salut, we have a watershed project where vetiver farming in upland areas has replaced most of the native forest cover. Widespread deforestation in the upper watershed means that intense rainfall, even for short periods of time, can quickly saturate the exposed terrain and result in flash forms, and this affects farmers experiencing low crop yields. To stop these cascading risks, UNEP worked with local farming cooperatives to include sustainable vetiver cultivation in the upper watersheds with local fisheries to improve fishing practices and better protect the remaining coral reef systems. Finally, I'd like to point out that the new resolution on nature-based solutions adopted at the UN Environment Assembly in March this year helps to accelerate implementation of nature-based solutions for disaster and conflicts. And in particular, to point out that we now have an agreed UN definition of nature-based solutions for the first time, and this is a significant milestone. When countries and companies claims their actions are supporting nature-based solutions, we can now begin to develop a common understanding of our aims and mutually reinforce what we do and track our progress. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. It's very powerful to note that actually nature-based solutions is an approach that is multidimensional, and we are looking at the various interdependencies between sectors. And what's coming out very strongly is the fact that we do need an integrated approach, but also the fact that nature-based solutions provides core benefits across sectors. You've had the discussion about, the submissions around food security, around water, around health, and ecosystem health as well. So this is a foundation certainly for strong economies and livelihoods. And so the interlinkages require that we do have a systemic lens in which we view the interdependencies, but as well as the solutions. And so nature-based solutions does provide an opportunity to address the challenges of climate and as well as disasters in a systematic approach. At this point, I just want to invite our next speaker, which is still Ms. Carolina, to tell us about how we can scale up the good practices of using nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation under different contexts and different institutional approaches. Ms. Carolina, can you come again?
Ministerio de Planificación, pensamos en el país en el corto, mediano y en el largo plazo. Y tal vez la primera forma de escalar las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza es incluyéndolas en los instrumentos de planificación del desarrollo del país, así como en los planes de gestión del cambio climático y del riesgo de desastres que formulan e implementan nuestros sectores. 2, hay que tener instrumentos financieros para facilitar el financiamiento de las NBS, es decir, en Colombia tenemos 2 alternativas. Los sectores productivos pagan por los gases efecto invernaderos emitidos o las emisiones de gases se compensan a través de proyectos de conservación y restauración de ecosistemas y de soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, por ejemplo, con enfoques de ecorreducción. 3, la verdad es que necesitamos un fuerte involucramiento del sector privado que muestre las NBS como un factor de competitividad. Para eso tenemos una estrategia para incluir medidas de adaptación ante riesgos climáticos en todas las cadenas de valor de las empresas y esto ha hecho posible que estén reduciendo sus riesgos, disminuyan costos, mejoren su reputación. Y esto me lleva a un cuarto punto y es que se requieren esfuerzos entre la nación y los territorios con inversiones de alto impacto en NBS. En Colombia tenemos una región llamada La Mojana, es uno de los humedales más grandes del mundo y los servicios ecosistémicos que prestan son vitales para todo el norte del país. Sin embargo, es una región que tiene problemas de inundaciones, en otras épocas del año sequías, hay conflictos de uso del suelo por actividades ganaderas, minería ilegal de oro y pues altos niveles de pobreza. En este momento el gobierno nacional y los gobiernos subnacionales están implementando un proyecto para aumentar la resiliencia climática, restaurar la regulación hídrica, implementar prácticas agropecuarias sostenibles y promover el turismo de naturaleza como una alternativa de empleo. Y son este tipo de proyectos los que nos dan la oportunidad de combinar obras tradicionales para el control de inundaciones con soluciones basadas en la naturaleza y hacer un fuerte trabajo interinstitucional entre las entidades que manejan la gestión del riesgo y los ministerios y los sectores de ambiente, agricultura, comercio, transporte, minas, obviamente con el trabajo con las comunidades locales.
Thank you very much, Carolina. I would want to invite Ms. Karina to also respond to the same question.
Thanks. So I think scaling up the good practices requires maybe 3 key ingredients. You've got obviously financing at scale, you've got maybe regulatory top-down pressure, but then you've also got the knowledge transfer and capacity building at scale. So if you take that last point, how do we convince both the financing funders and the decision makers on the ground that the best way is to go with nature versus the gray options? So what we're trying to do is to make this argument a little bit more powerful, a little bit more tangible, is to actually quantify the benefits of disaster risk reduction from nature-based solutions. And then actually looking at how much also do they cost to maintain, to set up, and then comparing this to the gray options so that you've got a numbers-based approach to really decide where financing should be best allocated. So as a concrete example, in Vietnam, we had estimated that typhoon and storm surge losses under the worst case scenario for climate by 2050 would come to about $8.5 billion on average per year. And if you used mangroves, sea dikes, and gabiones, you could reduce this by 87%. But then you have to think, well, how do you, if you've got scarce funding, how do you differentiate between those three options? So we further investigated, how much does the risk get reduced by mangroves and how much does it cost? And we found that for every dollar invested in mangroves, you avert $9 worth of damage. This ratio was $8 for gabiones and only $2 for sea dikes, showing that sea dikes are actually quite expensive, although very efficient. And that shows you how you can best allocate scarce funding. But then what about nature's other benefits? Could you quantify the carbon mitigation from the mangroves, its biodiversity impacts, the possibility to create ecotourism jobs, and to make that an even more attractive proposition? And then just another case where quantifying this disaster risk reduction actually led to a concrete change was in Mexico. In the state of Quintana Roo, the value of the coral reef's storm surge reduction was quantified, and this allowed or convinced the Quintana Roo state to start insuring and protecting these coral reefs. So global initiatives to quantify disaster risk reduction are already starting to proliferate. We've got Stanford has developed an INVEST platform that tries to quantify all the ecosystem services. Also, the Ocean Risk Alliance has created a coastal risk index, which we're supporting. But just to caveat that quantification is obviously just a first step. It takes time, you need data, and there's a lot of other barriers on the financing side, on the knowledge side, that still need to be addressed for scale.
Thank you very much. I think what's coming up very clearly on the area of scaling up is the issue of motivating for investments. And I think alongside that, we learned that there's a very strong role that government needs to play in terms of planning, as we've learned from Colombia, as well as promoting traditional knowledge. But very critical is the cost-benefit analysis, looking at the benefits, or rather building a business case for nature-based solutions. What are the benefits that it provides for some of the challenges that we do have, such as job creation, handling the issues of pollution, and other environmental health, but as well as, of course, the cost of reducing disasters. I imagine that that's really quite an important element, especially if we are to attract private sector investment that looks at return on investment. Allow me at this point to welcome our other panel speakers that are going to tell us, if you can please describe the progress which has been made in the field of nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction in the last few years through a couple of examples. So we'd want to see how these examples demonstrate the level of efficiency and added value on the implementation of nature-based solutions and its gains to both nature and human well-being. Could we invite Mr. Tabi to speak to us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thanks everybody. It's amazing to be in your midst today, and kindly accept my respects and honor to be together with you. I want to perhaps re-emphasize the importance of what you just mentioned earlier, where the earlier speakers talked about systemic risk. I come from the Sahel region in Africa, where it is acutely dry. And in the 11, 12 months of the year, you have sometimes just 2 months of rainfall. So you can imagine in your brain how life is at this region of the world and how livelihood can be undermined by the increasing threats of climate change. However, this is the background why nature-based solutions has become the centerpiece of the actions that we are taking in that region, and hence the solution, the 1 billion trees for Africa, which is supporting the Great Green Wall in restoring degraded lands and creating viable microeconomic opportunities derived from nature-based, like ecosystem restoration, biodiversity restoration as well, to create holistic opportunities that can socially, economically, and otherwise create the kind of resilience that people need. And as part of the milestones which can contribute, which are very critically exemplary in the space of nature-based solutions role in disaster risk reduction, is how we were able to plant over 3.7 million trees in the last 6 years, including some of the most globally highly needed tree products like shea butter trees, like cashew, like tamarindos, like baobab, and knowing very well that this is a region where landscapes have been so much degraded, fertile land is so much lost, and the acute nature of climate or heating or the warmness is so much actually not just degrading the physical landscape, but also degrading the human psychological state of the people. So this is now like one of the solutions which we brought in the space, and it was able to create about 500 direct green jobs in 37 communities around the Lake Chad, and this equally physically restored about 400 hectares of degraded land, which is physically very available on the maps, even on the GPS, you can look at that. And also in the field, in the course of this restoration of this creation of these 500 jobs, there are also over 3,000 indirect jobs in the value chains that were created, because our approach is actually using ecosystems and biodiversity value chains, especially on the non-timber forest products that are available in these communities as their own critical natural capital. We leverage it to create these opportunities. And of course, the opportunities have by and large actually helped in reducing the amount of the vulnerability to the migration that is very common in this region, because when people lose their fertile land, what happens to them is that they are forced to move. And this solution was able to bring back 12 young will-be climate migrants after their failed attempt to migrate across the Sahara and the Mediterranean to Europe. And they are fully integrated now, engaged in green jobs from nature-based solutions, ecosystem restoration. And of course, this has systemically and very strongly reduced the amount of the social tensions that often exist between pastoralists and farmers in this region, where in 20 communities we created this solution. We use nature-based solutions to create this approach that creates co-benefit from ecosystem resources that helps in bringing together and creating social cohesion in these communities and reducing the social tensions that have been existing there. Perhaps if you read from the news, you see that around the Lake Chad, there has been reduced tension from, from the past 6 years. Progressively, there is reduced tension between pastoralists and farmers, significantly linked to these approaches and these solutions. This is just to say generally that the impact of nature-based solutions in this region is so significant, and of course holistically well adapted in enhancing the people's resilience and reducing their risk, and of course enhancing their capacity to be able to live together, because resilience cannot be present where there is social upheavals. And social cohesion is a very important aspect in reducing systemic risk wherever context that exists. And this is very important that jobs also play a very critical role. So for us, jobs is very important at the center. reducing migration or the vulnerabilities of migration is very important, and reducing the social upheavals that are resultant from the competition of scarce natural resources, especially the ecosystem resources, is very critical. And of course, these are the tangible and measurable milestones that we have been able to put on ground that can credibly be linked to the capacity to reduce the risk and, of course, enhancing resilience, holistically reducing systemic risk along this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I want to ask Mr. Saparis to give us examples from Indonesia.
Thank you, moderator. On behalf of Ministry of Environment and Forestry, I would like to present our commitment in implementing NPS for disaster risk reduction in terms of landscape approach. Developing landscape-based land utilization system and its integration into spatial planning lead to improve landscape stability and subsequently reduce the natural disaster escalation as occurred in various natural hazard prone in Indonesia. For example, Harkajaya village in West Java, and also flood event in Bima, West Nusa Tenggara. In fact, the program have successfully generated people awareness to understand and to maintain their land by considering ecosystem characteristic, conservation principles, and adaptation schemes in facing the disaster. The awareness of people should be addressed because Indonesia is surrounded by active tectonic plate arranged by mountainous and hilly terrain and also composed by loose material. Population growth and regional development tend to increase disaster vulnerability due to natural exploitation by people tends to exceed the environment carrying capacity. Indonesia proves that implementation of watershed management, forest rehabilitation, and soil conservation program for landscape stability brings economic resilience, create green jobs, raise incomes, and increase food and water security. It helps biodiversity to recover, improve massive atmospheric carbon sequestration, and support disaster resilience. Multi-stakeholders collaboration and transformative effort via public-private partnership should be promoted to mobilize crowdsourcing scheme for disaster mitigation and adaptation, and eventually establish people resilience. Hopefully, our mention relevant with definition of NPS as mentioned by Ms. Sonia and also by Ms. Caroline. Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this point, I just want to, we are going into a second segment of our discussions this morning, and we're looking at overcoming the barriers to the implementation of nature-based solutions. We will start off by watching a short video, and this video is centering on some of the barriers that we need to address in scaling up nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction. And some of these barriers, of course, include siloed financing, but at the same time, non-inclusion of local communities. So we'll be looking at one case study from the mitigation from Sri Lanka, landslides mitigation in Sri Lanka, and then one from the coastal conservation and restoration in China.
Perhaps the biggest constraints in applying nature-based solutions is the issue of confidence in that it would work. Well, it's been promoted across Asia in many places as a sustainable, cost-effective approach that can involve local communities. Take-up has not been perhaps as high as expected because there is also perhaps a perception that this is not high-tech enough, or that the stability and the effectiveness is perhaps not the same as using concrete, for example. deforestation, poor land use planning. And that, coupled with the increased intensity and frequency of rainfall, has resulted in an increased frequency of landslides. There are a few policies and a few institutions which are taking the approach of using environmental approaches such as nature-based solutions in dealing with landslide risk management. There isn't as much funding available for these approaches as there is for the more traditional concrete and steel approaches. Some of them also have economic value, which brings extra benefits to the communities, whether they are plants or seeds that can be sold and bring in some economic value, which add to the benefits of these nature-based solutions. By demonstrating that this works and by finding the specifics that are useful for Sri Lanka, we hope that these projects will overcome these issues and be able to be more easily adopted and involve the community so they can see the benefits for themselves.
We use natural restoration as the main approach and artificial restoration as the supplement to conserve and restore mangroves, coral reefs, and sandy beaches. Studies have shown that these conservation and restoration programs are effective in mitigation of marine disasters. For example, a 500-meter wide mangrove belt can reduce wave height by 50 to 99%. Challenges remain ahead in the combat with the marine disasters. The roles of coastal ecosystems are not fully understood and considered in investment decision-making for eco-DRR. To achieve the co-benefits of ecosystem integrity, climate resilience, and the reduction of the risks of typhoon, storm surges, and other marine disasters. Natural and anthropogenic causes for disasters, including climate change, require systemic approach in response measures. We take a safety-oriented approach, which means to transform coastal defense measures from traditional gray infrastructure to the equal use of safe regulating and supporting functions of ecosystems. We will continue to apply ecosystem approach and integrated coastal management so as to improve the quality of life and happiness for peoples.
Thank you. At this point, I just want to take us to discuss the barriers. So what are the barriers to the implementation of nature-based solutions in disaster risk reduction? And how can we strategically address this through innovative approaches? Let's hear from a number of panelists. I'll start with Mr. Tabi.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Certainly, the video actually shared something that is so self-explanatory to everybody. You saw the last handshake that actually happened is something that is so seriously absent most often, where there is a convergence between solution providers and solution receivers. This needs to be considered as a huge barrier. And of course, that is so related to the fact that most often the solutions that are given in some contexts are top-down approaches, which is a huge barrier. Nature-based solution has a lot to do with the culture, the psychology the sociology, the anthropology of people. That means every contextual situation, people have what constitutes solutions for them that needs to be strongly considered, and most often it is not considered. For instance, in my community, it is very difficult for you to produce a solution from New York or from Cambridge to actually implant it in my community because it will not work. Rather, you need to understand the ancestral knowledge that has worked in that community over the centuries that could just be enhanced and made as a long-term or sustainable solution for the people. So, of course, this is very, very common. And then one other thing that's is a barrier is the fact that financing is often not channeled to the right nature-based solutions. And nature-based solution is looked at in isolation, just about the whole idea of planting trees. And even in itself, it is wrong. And just about the idea, if you look at nature solution or nature-based solution, just like planting trees, you are wrong. It's a huge barrier. And then people just go around planting trees, planting monoculture forests. That does not provide any catalyst for microeconomic development of these communities that needs to have this resilience that you want to create. So these are huge barriers. Rather, we should be looking at the integrated approaches that holistically connects to the social, economic, psychological, anthropological, and sociological, dignity and the livelihood of the people that could actually reduce the holistic systemic risk that we're talking about. This involves most often the weakness of all of society approaches. And then some of the barriers that we have also seen is that we are not talking to each other. We are doing our things in isolation. There are silos more than there are collaborations. There are people doing things just where they are in their own comfort without relating. For instance, I just mentioned in our solution how we were able to hold back, bring back, integrate 12 would-be climate migrants from their failed attempt to migrate across the Mediterranean to face the risk of migration or rather drowning in the Mediterranean. Who is looking at this as a solution? Is it just seen by some people like some local thing that happened somewhere, but not seen as an approach that has a connection with the psychosocial condition of these people that could create the incentive that will reduce somebody's temptation of wanting to go somewhere rather choosing to be somewhere where he feels or she feels that there is dignity and their life is tied to something. So of course, these are very, very important things that we need to know. And generally, some of the barriers we need to understand. The projects take too long to reach the people who need these projects or who need these solutions. So much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll ask Ms. Carolina to also come on board.
Muchas gracias, Mr. Luther. Primero hay que superar la barrera de credibilidad y de certidumbre sobre el costo-beneficio que tienen las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza para la reducción de condiciones de riesgo. Cuando se hacen análisis de alternativas de proyectos de inversión, según el Banco Mundial, la infraestructura verde puede ser hasta un 30% más barata de construir y un 25% menos costosa en mantenimiento durante la vida útil en comparación con infraestructura gris. Esto me lleva a una segunda barrera y es que los tomadores de decisiones no identifican las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza como una medida de competitividad, con beneficios ambientales, económicos y sociales, donde las mismas entidades responsables de la gestión del riesgo priorizan obras tradicionales. Y esto ocurre muchas veces porque los resultados de las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza no son visibles en el corto plazo, pero sí requieren una inversión importante de recursos en sus fases iniciales y mayores tiempos de implementación, y también porque hay una presión política por esa necesidad de tener obras que se puedan ver físicamente y que se perciben como única solución al problema. Y una tercera barrera es que muchas de las metodologías y el tipo de soluciones no reconocen la heterogeneidad de cada territorio en términos ecológicos o sociales o de las capacidades técnicas, operativas o financieras de quienes lo implementan. Es decir, hay metodologías que son muy exigentes en información y asumen que se van a trabajar en territorios con una gobernanza ideal que no existe en la realidad. Por ejemplo, cómo poder implementar este tipo de proyectos en asentamientos urbanos de una ciudad informal, pues que es precisamente donde se concentran los riesgos. Tal vez una manera de ir superando este tipo de barreras ahora en Colombia, con el apoyo de Global Initiative on Disaster Risk Management de la Cooperación Alemana para el Desarrollo, estamos implementando la guía técnica para la evaluación y la planificación integral de riesgos en el contexto de cambio climático, una guía que fue elaborada por UNDRR y la GIZ, y vamos a tener dos grandes resultados. Uno, el fortalecimiento de capacidades para evaluar estos riesgos sistémicos y proponer soluciones basadas en la naturaleza para reducir condiciones de riesgo. Y dos, vamos a tener todos los requerimientos técnicos, institucionales, legales, económicos y financieros de cómo incluir este tipo de soluciones en los instrumentos de planificación, también en los instrumentos del riesgo y de cambio climático a nivel subnacional.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Could I ask the same question to Karina?
Sure. So firstly, just reiterating what Carolina's just said, and also from the video, what Hans was saying, we've also seen that there's definitely a lack of certainty over whether nature actually works as an eco-DRR solution. So for instance, we heard that a French city that had actually received European funding specifically to use nature-based solutions for flood protection, it was the city officials themselves that were worried that it wasn't going to work and that wanted to go the safe route, choosing the grey infrastructure. So how do we get around that kind of issue or that kind of barrier? I think it has to be knowledge sharing, it has to be sharing of all the success stories, maybe tapping into the city networks, and equally maybe also some top-down rules that force some minimum quotas of nature-based solutions to be put in place. But I also just wanted to look at financial barriers. I think it was UNEP that has estimated that $536 billion is needed every year until 2050 to reach our climate, biodiversity, land degradation targets. But we're only seeing 133 billion per year actually flowing into nature-based solutions. And of this, just 14% is actually coming from the private sector, which is a drop in the ocean of its potential. But we speak to a lot of impact investors, development finance institutions, and they come back with the same problem. They all have a lot of pressure and motivation to invest in adaptation, both green and grey, but it is largely not revenue generating. And the private sector does need some kind of return, even if modest. So maybe one way around this is to differentiate between revenue generating investments. So you could think of a marine protected area that has mangroves, that has carbon credits associated to it. It has ecotourism revenue, sustainable fishery revenue attached to it, and channel that towards the private sector and leave the rest for the public sector. And maybe you could bundle higher and lower return investments together. And we need to be creative in how to generate income from nature, as cynical as that sounds. Is it carbon credits? Is it trying to get the private sector who is benefiting from nature to contribute? So maybe coastal hotels that benefit from the coral reefs could pay a small tax. I think having that revenue, obviously it attracts more financing, you tap into the private sector, but it equally allows premium, a revenue stream to be used for premium, for insurance, to protect those natural assets. And insurance can also be another innovative solution to unlock more financing. So I think it's quite theoretical at the moment, but essentially the theory is that if you've got eco-DRR in place, you reduce the risk, and therefore your insurance premium should go down, and that savings on the premium could then be flow back into more adaptation investment. Another innovative solution could be blended finance, which can be really catalytic when you're using, first loss guarantees from the public sector to allow lots of private sector funding to come in. And then the last point, I think, is bringing up the financial sector up to speed with the benefits of nature and the risks of the loss of nature. I think climate has been quite mainstreamed now, but nature still is just starting to become a criteria. I think this will start to be maybe accelerated with things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, but I think a lot more needs to be done. Thanks.
Thank you. As you can see, there are so many barriers, ranging from credibility. I think you kept hearing about credibility, which is quite a very important point. People don't really quite understand yet the advantages of nature-based solutions and the benefits, or rather, these are not yet well articulated. There are also other barriers related to finance that have been spoken about at length. And I think the key issue here is the fact that diverse financing mechanisms are required for nature-based solutions, but it's not unclear the return on investment. And we've also talked about inclusion. I think this has come out so strongly, the fact that this is an approach that requires to be very inclusive. It also requires to be transparent. And I think there are elements there that require capacity building. And of course, the aspect of an integrated approach, not working in silos, and focusing on a context-specific appropriateness in the application of nature-based solutions. And I think what also came out was the private-public sector engagements, especially around governments and private sector, and how that interface works. So there seem to be a number of barriers, but at the same time, there have been a number of solutions suggested, including insurance de-risking and blended finance. So at this time, I just want us to move on to talking about the different perspectives that do exist. And so I would want to ask Mr. Saparis, from your perspective in Indonesia, what is needed to further integrate nature-based solutions to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation planning and decision-making?
Okay. Thank you, Moderator. Once again, I would like to stress the importance of landscape approach in articulating nature-based solution based on our experience in Indonesia. Actually, nature-based solution approach should be addressed on landscape governance, particularly to ensure various natural resources utilization consider landscape stability with accordance to topographic condition, soil properties, geological formation, and socio-economic aspect. To realize the above requirement, availability of high resolution satellite imagery and natural resources inventory advanced technology are absolutely needed to identify properly disaster risk reduction based natural resource management. In conjunction to scale up NBS, Indonesia has been implementing forest and other land use netting carbon 2030. We call it volume netting by 2030. This program has been launched and constructed based on our experience and knowledge in implementing policies and international cooperation for the last 7 years with regard to forest fire, peatland management, permanent moratorium for new licenses in primary forest and peatland, biodiversity conservation, forest and land rehabilitation, community participation, and law enforcement. We really expect all of them lead to establishment of food, water, and energy security and lead to people prosperity. Moreover, we really expect developed countries related various UN convention parties such as UNFCCC, UNCBD, and UNCCD. I have just attended in COP15 UNCCD in Abidjan 2 weeks ago. And financial institution helps Indonesia's commitment to restore degraded land for reducing hydrometeorological disaster related to climate change. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saparis.
Yeah.
I would want to ask a question around how we can ensure that efforts to scale up nature-based solutions also contribute to the achievement of the wider SDGs. For example, advancing pandemic recovery or reducing inequalities. And I think this may help us to address the issue of credibility. At this point, I want to invite Ms. Sonja to speak to us.
Thanks. I think this builds very well on the comments being made previously. Nature-based approaches are underpinned by the understanding that human societies are part of environmental systems, and healthy ecosystems improve people's health and well-being, and in so doing, they bring jobs and they boost livelihoods. So nature-based solutions are among our strongest allies in the fight to reduce poverty, hunger, and inequality. What we have observed is that we have many examples of nature-based solutions that still remain small-scale or at project level. And therefore, it is really important to reflect on these experiences and challenges ourselves to reach greater impact towards enhancing both people and our planet's resilience, which will contribute more broadly to the achievement of the NDCs. So I think there are different ways that we can scale up nature-based solutions, and allow me to touch on 3 of them. One major lesson from UNEP's work is that mainstreaming nature-based solutions into existing national development programs with already established national budgets allows countries to rapidly scale up nature-based solutions while hitting their development goals. And so we have examples, for instance, where we're working with partners for resilience consortium at the community level to learn how to do this better and to show up how to scale up and influence national programs. And as we saw in that video, partners are doing this in Uganda, and here in Indonesia, Wetlands International is scaling up their biorights community-based approach in peatland conservation by working with the National Agency for Peat and Mangrove Restoration. So key too is the importance of working with communities to find local solutions that can be scaled up to national and regional levels. The second point, which has been made before by other speakers, is we also need to leverage the finance sector. The finance gap will be 4.1 trillion by 2050. To meet our global climate, biodiversity, and land degradation targets, we have to have investments that need to triple over the next 10 years. Unfortunately, our financial community just isn't sufficiently aware of the value of nature and what it means for our planetary and health resilience. UNEP's finance initiative is working very hard to change this, but we do have some way to go, we must admit. And my third reflection is that we need to do a better, and I would say countries need to do a better job at reporting on the health of their ecosystems in the Sendai Framework Monitor. Better monitoring of our green infrastructure would allow us to better measure our progress towards achieving the SDGs, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and other Rio conventions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those contributions. I would also want to invite Carina to respond.
I think on the SDG side, this is a little bit outside of my scope, but for nature-based solutions to be much more far-reaching in the development objectives, I think it needs to be systematically localized. AXA, I mean, this has been a message that's been repeated often, but just as a tangible example, AXA insures the Mesoamerican Coral Reef Fund, And there, a key part of the initiative is actually, so we're insuring them against cyclones. And the key part is training the local community to quickly reattach coral, remove debris, etc., after the cyclone has happened. And that means that they're getting directly paid from the insurance payout, and they are increasing their awareness of how to preserve their own coral reefs. So if we could systematically have that localization aspect included on every nature-based solutions, then you could increase local jobs plus have that increased awareness. So I think I'm just repeating what everyone's saying. But another key to embracing more SDGs, I think, is on flexibility. So we've heard of a Pacific Island state that was looking to actually reverse the protected status of its marine areas in order to exploit them for revenue, which sounds horrendous, but they're in a corner because COVID has actually killed their tourism industry, which was the backbone of their economy. So they really need to think of alternatives. So is there a kind of a flexible medium where we can have conservation on one hand to preserve nature and all its benefits, including eco-DRR, but then also on the other hand allow for some kind of sustainable revenue generating activities that the local communities can benefit from, sustainable fishing, sustainable ecotourism, so that you can embrace more of the SDGs without compromising nature too much.
Thank you. I think from all those examples, you can note that what seems to be quite important is the element of expanding knowledge and awareness of how nature-based solutions addresses multiple challenges, and how mainstreaming helps in scaling up. I see that we can build on a lot of examples have been given on building on what we're already doing, especially when it comes to mainstreaming for purposes of scaling up. But the issues of leveraging the private sector still came up, and also the issue of being context specific, that is localizing systematically as was mentioned. But I think much more important is flexibility. It means that this is an approach that is not a textbook kind of solution. It's really organic. It has to look at the local context. It has to look at the involvement of local people. It has to look at building on local knowledge, and as well as being appropriate to the context. At this point, I just wanted us to move to our next steps. By the way, for people who have not, who will probably join later, please do post your questions on the Slido, because we're moving on to the question and answer session. At this point in time, I would want to ask, to invite the audience to ask their questions on Slido. Let me just check here. So we have a number of questions coming in. So one of them is to Karina. Karina, did you ever convince a company to invest in nature-based solutions in order to reduce the premium of an insurance product? And maybe related to that would be, in order to mainstream nature-based solutions, you will have to sell the idea of to SMEs. And so how do you do this? How do you move from nature-based solutions being a niche? And yes, so maybe Karina, you can answer that first.
So unfortunately, that whole theory on reducing the risk and then being able to funnel that back into adaptation investment hasn't kind of materialized just yet. There's been a few attempts, notably not ACTS ourselves, but Risico, I think, in the Philippines was trying to do this. But it's starting to happen. We are speaking right now to a Spanish hotel chain that is investigating and very, at CEO level, and they're a big chain, they are actively investigating how they can, get involved on coral reef protection, on mangrove plantation, etc., as part of their strategy to protect themselves, get risk reductions on the insurance side, and obviously, tick a lot of boxes on TCFD, TNFD, and all the other kind of regulatory aspects that are obliging them in a way to start embracing these things. But I think they also want to be pioneers, to show that this kind of thing works and can be done. But equally, they're working with us to see, can they finance it not just out of this, corporate social responsibility budget, but equally out of some tangible premium reductions that the insurance companies, I think, would be happy to do, because obviously it's tangible risk reduction, and it also is exactly the kind of thing that a lot of the insurance companies want to be doing. They want to be seen to be pro-nature, pro-climate. So it's starting, but it's not at scale just yet.
Yeah, thank you. And one question to all the various speakers. How can funding for nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction in developing countries be scaled up? Funding is currently very limited, and I must say it's even non-existent, especially with COVID. And so this is similar to climate finance. How can funding for nature-based solutions for DRR in developing countries be scaled up? And maybe related to that is, how can donors work more closely with the private sector to promote eco-DRR projects? This is open to the various panelists. Anyone? Yes, Sonja? Okay, yes, Toby?
Okay, good. In three ways. First, I think let's be just in terms of delivering financing or funding in whatever circumstance that is. Looking at loss and damage is very critical and eminent, that we look at that as a key financing mechanism, especially for developing countries. Like you said, the question direct. And then we also have to look at financing, like what I mentioned in my solution. It is not just about the top-down money pumped into something. How do you enhance already existing microeconomic systems that are functioning, that are equally scalable from the community level, that can in itself constitute a source of stabilizing already nature-based solutions that are happening? That's another way of looking at it. And then, of course, thirdly, it's important that private sector should look at what kind of margin, not just selective financing, because selective financing only furthers or creates more opportunities for those who have access to land and deprive those who don't have access to land, because much of nature-based solutions are around land and water, land and sea and whatever. So let it be in an equitable way, that it has a balanced approach, that it's delivered across a wide margin, so that it trickles down to every other person. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other person? Yeah, yes.
I'll quickly add, from the private sector view, I think I already mentioned the fact that revenue generating is the most obvious way to attract private sector funding. But then I didn't actually mention bundling. Another barrier on the financial side is the fact that these projects are so small. And the minimum ticket size for pension, for DFI, Development Finance Institution, is $10 to $15 million. So they need these projects to be aggregated on some kind of platform, so that they can easily tap into, and provide this large funding. So this is the case for all of the large institutional investors, pension funds, insurers, DFIs. They need scale. The other aspect that I thought would be interesting to delve into is the blended finance. I'm not exactly sure how it would work in the context of eco-DRR investment, but I do know that it has worked in the case of unlocking private sector funding into emerging countries. Because obviously, for instance, the big institutional investors like insurance companies need AAA grade investments as a minimum. So having that kind of grade in an emerging country can be difficult. So what happens is, as an example, AXA linked up, and this wasn't the only company, there was a few that did that, linked up with the World Bank Group's IFC. They got a development bank, SIDA, the Swedish Development Agency, to provide a first loss guarantee on a portfolio of infrastructure investments in emerging countries. And then that first loss guarantee allowed the portfolio overall to become A grade. And suddenly all the insurers and all the big investors that have these strict criteria could suddenly come in and match IFC's funding for infrastructure in these emerging countries. So I think it's a really powerful example that can be potentially replicated to climate adaptation investments, specifically infrastructure that's green, gray, adaptation investment. So that's just one, I think, powerful example. Yeah, that was it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. It does show clearly that there's still many obstacles towards financing for nature-based solutions in the developing countries, because we're looking at the arguments for loss and damage, which means that we need to bring in the climate arguments. We are looking at use of local resources, which is a very good approach, but as we also know that this is extremely limited, and then we do need innovative approaches to attract private sector funding, which requires scale, and also other de-risking tools to be able to attract that level of funding. There is another question here. A lot has been talked about localizing of nature-based solutions approach, which speakers have highlighted as being very critical. Are there any additional good practices in engaging vulnerable groups, such as displaced communities? What can governments and international organizations do to support? Maybe I could start with Carolina.
Mr. Luther, pues en Colombia, digamos, tenemos tal vez diferentes ejemplos de cómo se puede trabajar, sobre todo con comunidades locales, pero sobre todo hay un punto importante y es que es importante tener claridad sobre los marcos conceptuales y normativos de qué es lo que se considera finalmente un proyecto de soluciones basadas en la naturaleza con el enfoque de reducción del riesgo de desastres. Tal vez sin tener claridad en eso, por ejemplo, en un país como Colombia, es incluso difícil implementar acciones y sobre todo disponer recursos para que esto se puedan hacer en los sectores y los territorios. Y otro tipo de, digamos, medidas a través de las cuales podemos incentivar o tener como experiencias prácticas de cómo se puede trabajar en territorio, es trabajar en unos proyectos estándar de soluciones basadas en la naturaleza con el enfoque de ecorreducción, pues porque estos proyectos estándar sobre todo nos pueden ayudar a minimizar los costos en toda la fase de diseño, sobre todo cuando estamos hablando de comunidades con, digamos, bajos niveles de recursos, pero también pueden incentivar a esa participación de la pequeña y mediana empresa. En Colombia tenemos algunas experiencias para las regiones, como les decía, en La Mojana, también algunas regiones para el norte del Caribe, pero sobre todo tenemos experiencias muy interesantes involucradas especialmente con el sector privado y la pequeña y la mediana empresa que tal vez podríamos conocer después en detalle, pero pues eso sería como algunos de los comentarios que tendría hasta ahora, Mr. Luther.
Okay, thank you very much, Sonja, with that example, especially around design and cost, and also incentives for SMEs as a part of private sector that is much more localized. I think that's quite a good example. Now, I would want to ask to respond to the previous question on financing. Yes, Paris.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, I would like to add a brief explanation about the financial mobilization. I am at the national focal point for UNCCD. In the COP13 in China, UNCCD recommend transformative project via involvement of public-private partnership. And in implementing the scheme in Indonesia, we mobilize budget and finance from mining companies and plantation companies. From their contribution, we built a big nursery to provide seed for restore degraded land and degraded mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia. And I think it is our president suggestion. And I think from our initiative, it can be mobilized huge budget for restore the degraded land and degraded ecosystem, mangrove ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. There is a question around how can we ensure credibility and quality of nature-based solutions for DRR, particularly when some companies continue to have a negative environmental impact through their practices, outweighing the potential benefits of NBS. And in some cases, nature-based solutions are implemented in ways that fail. So maybe you can talk about some ideas around greenwashing and how we can deal with that. Anyone in the panel? Okay.
One very key way to get that is to have traceability, transparent traceability, because traceability can actually give very clearly the source of any resource or any product and how it was produced, from what community it came from, and what kind of approaches were used in the processes of that product development, product transportation, product processing, and of course, from fork to, from farm to fork. So this traceability is very important, I think, can actually provide sufficient, to some extent, credibility.
I think we also need the transparency. I think sometimes let me remove this, it might be easier to hear me. We may be overcomplicating sometimes as well what some of these solutions are and how it brings people on board in what it really means. So let me give a different example to show maybe how we can build credibility. So if I look at trees, investing in trees, right? If we put in 100 million annually in street trees, it would give 77 million people a 1 degree reduction in maximum temperature on hot days. And a 1 degree reduction is huge, yeah? Urban trees in 10 of the world's mega cities would then generate 482 million in health cost savings as a result of the reduction in pollutants. So it's not only a direct financial investment that you're looking to then make money, it's also about the savings and the improvement in our quality of life that these investments can bring. And nature-based solutions are on average 50% more cost-effective than the gray alternatives and deliver 28% more added value. So we have to use different ways of communicating to build the credibility, the direct investment and where it goes with green jobs, but also where we're getting savings and improvements in our quality of life.
Thank you. I know we are soon running out of time. Maybe I'll just ask the panelists to give one parting shot. Any last word that you have on nature-based solutions? We'll start with Carolina.
Sí, específicamente sobre el tema de greenwashing, creo que en realidad cualquier proyecto ambiental es susceptible de esto y tal vez una de las maneras de manejar este problema es a través de la taxonomía verde. Esto es un sistema de clasificación que define las características de los activos o las actividades económicas para ser elegibles como verde, pero sobre todo esta clasificación permite garantizar y dar seguimiento a los recursos que se asignan y por eso es un apoyo importante a los diferentes actores, a las entidades públicas, pero sobre todo al sector privado, es decir, como Karina le había mencionado, los emisores de bonos, los inversionistas, las instituciones financieras, cómo se pueden identificar y evaluar cuáles inversiones cumplen con los objetivos ambientales, bueno, y en este caso específico, cuáles son esos criterios y cómo se cumplen frente a las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza. Colombia en este momento acaba de lanzar la taxonomía verde, somos el primer país de América Latina que cuenta con esa taxonomía y el cuarto en el mundo, y tal vez es una de las mejores maneras de garantizar que ese tipo de inversiones sean transparentes y evitar el greenwashing.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Muchayamad. Any last word?
Okay. I think we have to involve people, local people in the field, and because local people has knowledge and understand about the land suitability and also properly type of vegetation to be planted in there. In 2020, we have experience. We have a national economic recovery program for rehabilitated degraded mangrove ecosystem. And I think from the program, we can improve people income in the field. And also we can improve degraded mangrove ecosystem. I think it's very important because if we talk about nature-based solution, we have to identify physical condition in the field, and I think we have to involve people in the field, and I think people in the field are extremely understand and knows the situation and physical condition in the land. I think it's a strategic way to restore the land based on our landscape approach, as I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm encouraged by the discussions that we've had this morning and the various examples that have been shared and also the questions raised, because it's clear that we already hold an important piece to the puzzle in addressing systematic risks to disaster and climate change by investing in healthy, well-managed ecosystems. And as the IPCC report the recently released one shared, we understand the importance of integration of people and nature and emphasizing the role of equity and justice as well for planetary health. So I think working with nature through nature-based solutions is a key leverage point to addressing systematic risks. And I think that the more that we have forums such as this, and that our governments are empowered to work not only at the legislative government level, but also at the community-based level, that we can work to effectively address and deliver on these risks.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank
Tabi?
you. I just want to perhaps reiterate that we have all seen from the examples that I shared how effective and efficient natural solutions can be in driving or catalyzing, economic opportunities for communities that helps in reducing the vulnerabilities that actually create disasters or the vulnerabilities on different systemic risk. this is very possible that nature solutions can be scaled, they can be sustained, they can be adapted, and they can actually be driven even at the most basic community level. And I just want to also bring your attention to what we are doing in Africa in the Great Green Wall, which is actually the world's largest nature solution, the biggest nature mosaic that is currently being built from Senegal to Djibouti, a band of 8,000 kilometers of trees, which will holistically actually create huge opportunities, reducing huge amount of disasters, not just for Africa, but imagine the amount of carbon that will globally be reduced as a result of the billions of trees that will be planted. That's why the 1 billion trees for Africa is a project that you all, or we all, should actually be behind, because it delivers not just local solutions, actually at the global scale, solutions that humanity needs right now. But most importantly, when we come together, there is nothing we cannot achieve. Thank you.
Yes, Carolina.
So I'll go back to those three criteria on scaling up nature-based solutions. Firstly, on the regulation side, definitely we need to have a lot of top-down pressure. We need TNFD, we need natural disclosures, we need implementation of nature-based solutions to be required as a minimum quota. Equally, and then on the financing, I think, can we figure out the revenue streams that can come from nature in a sustainable way? And then can we bundle these projects together so that you can tap into that huge potential of the private sector? And then lastly, on sharing knowledge and capacity building, I think this goes to that last point about guidance on credibility of nature-based solutions. So I understand the UN has now got a guide on what exactly nature-based solutions are, but can that be extended to be a technical guide and manual to help to understand what types of mangroves to plant in certain regions, to be able to do them in an efficient way that creates more credibility and certainty around how they work, and equally to then share this knowledge as much as possible across all the different networks of cities, of financial groups, so that awareness is raised as much as possible. Thanks.
Thank you. I think this morning we've had a very interesting session, and we're recognizing that nature is just not only at risk, but it's also a solution. And it has to be people-centered. It requires resources and increased investments. And we recognize that scale is important, not just for the benefits, but also to catalyze and attract financing and investments, and that we do require an integrated approach. I just wanted to end by saying that on the issue of greenwashing, because today the word nature-based solutions is becoming a buzzword, people are using it as they wish, but actually nature-based solutions has a clear definition. It must provide benefits for both nature and for people simultaneously. And this is possible when you follow certain criteria, when you follow some parameters. And so IUCN has established what we call the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions, which helps to improve the effectiveness of such interventions, but also their equitability, transparency, and sustainability, meaningful participation of vulnerable and historically marginalized groups, and positive contributions to biodiversity and ecosystem health. So while we use nature-based solutions, it actually has very clear parameters. But I want to end here by thanking all our panelists this morning for their contributions, and for thanking each one of you for the powerful questions that you provided. At this point, we'll vacate the room so that it will be prepared and cleaned for the next session. And also, let's follow in line with the COVID-19 regulations. Please check on your GP 2020 agenda and make sure that you're on time for your next session. Once again, thank you very much.
you.